Cloud. All right. Well, welcome everybody. It is so nice to have you all here for this Lunch and Learn. This is one I was really excited about. This is part of a 2-session series on Jews and Broadway.
We might enjoy this.
People you can keep your mics open, but if you like get a phone call or something, feel free to just mute it.
How about we mute everyone, and
Okay.
then if someone has a question, they can.
That's
just
a
to keep it safe.
fine
But you need to hit the mute all, otherwise
I'm gonna do that.
I'll mute you.
Okay. I am not. Don't think of this as silencing everyone's voices. Think of it as partially silencing everyone's voices. So this session in particular, if you're looking for Fiddler, that's next week. Because what we're going to talk about today is the Jews of Broadway, the Jewish people that made Broadway what it is, right? We know that when we list off the number of people on the number of Jews on Broadway, the list goes on and on. Richard Rodgers, Lorenz Hart, Jerome Kern, Oscar Hammerstein, both the first and the second, right? Irving Berlin, the Gershwins, Yip Harburg, Kurt Weill, Adler Ross, Sammy Kahn, Stephen Schwartz, Stephen Sondheim, who you'll find out is a great hero of mine, a great hero of my family. So many of the people who make American musical theater what it is are Jews. And what we're going to do today is sort of figure out why that is and how they shaped it. I grew up in a household where there was almost daily worship of what I believe are sort of the two main venues for Jewish immigrants in the early 20th century to become American, okay? And those are musical theater and baseball, right? These were quintessentially American things that allowed Jews to kind of cut their teeth on what it means to be a part of American society. But the story of Jewish people involved in Broadway and musical theater, I believe, starts a little bit before Only a Fan of one of the things. I like baseball. I'm just not obsessed with it. But the point is the Jewish involvement in musical theater starts before Broadway and the American musical even exist. And it starts with professional Yiddish theater, which we know started in Europe and then continued into the United States with the waves of Jewish immigration in the 19th century and early 20th century. So mostly centered on Second Avenue in New York City, which is where most of the Jews lived. Yiddish theater kind of started. It got really big in the US in the 1880s, which is when you start seeing huge waves of immigration by Russian Jews, who all know Yiddish. And in the 1880s, it was all about like operettas and light comedic shows and kind of folly style reviews. But what's really interesting is that they are all very Jewish stories, right? They're about rabbis and matchmakers and housewives getting ready for Shabbos. These are distinctly Jewish stories. Most of the non-Jewish stories you would see in Yiddish theater would have been translations of Gilbert and Sullivan or Shakespeare. There was a golden age of serious Yiddish drama starting in 1892 with a show called The Yiddish King Lear. But then as even more Jews came, they went back to being fun and light. But while it started off very, very Jewish, and even though the themes continued to be Jewish, by 1925, the New York Times had already declared that New York's Yiddish theater was thoroughly Americanized. It became an American thing. Stepping back one second, why did Jews get into theater? Why would Jews be involved in theater? There are a couple possible answers, right? One of them could be, I think that the Jewish style of conversation and storytelling is naturally theatrical and a little dramatic. Linguistic scholars will point out that the most distinctive element of sort of the Jewish conversational style is loudly and enthusiastically interrupting each other, right? So it might just be the way that we are. Second off, it was musical theater and Jewish theater were a really good way to get a job. They couldn't really get jobs at any of the pre-established theaters. They couldn't really go to any of the music schools because they didn't allow in Jews, but this was sort of a new frontier, right? This was a new area for them to go into. The same way that a lot of Jews were at the center of early comic books because they couldn't get into regular publishing. There were too many institutional barriers because they were Jewish. Another thing is that all of the Jewish kids whose families could afford it were getting piano lessons because it's, they think, well, maybe it could be a living. Not really sure. But the bottom line is that Yiddish theater was really big. And I think that's where you find the roots of Jewish involvement on Broadway. So I wanted to play 2 pieces from Yiddish theater. And we're going to see where they sort of interact with American music. So the first one, I'm going to share the lyrics of it because they are not as cute as you might think. But this was a song composed by Shalom Secunda with lyrics by Jacob Jacobs from the 1932 musical comedy Meken Leben Normalos Neat, which means one could really live, but they won't let you. It's called By Mir Bist Du Schön, which means to me you are beautiful. And it became a really big hit. Sammy Kahn, who's famous for Let It Snow, Let It Snow, Let It Snow, one of the secular Jewish Christmas songs, wrote an English version. And this is my favorite thing, right? And maybe you can listen to it with this in mind. In 1938, this Yiddish song, like this Yiddish comedy song, was a huge hit in Nazi Germany because they did not realize it was written by a Jew. They thought it was some bizarre German dialect. Once they found out, they banned it. But everybody loved this song, even the people who hated the Jews the most. So let's listen. This is a recording by the Milken Archive, sung by cantor Simon Spiro.
Wenn die soll sein schwarz wie a Tute, wenn die hast Augen wie bei a Kute, und wenn die hinkt sie bisslich, hast Hilzene Fieslich, so geh du satt mich nicht. Und wenn die hast a narischen Schmechel, und wenn die hast weiße Sechel, wenn die bist wild wie ein Indianer, bist a viele Galizianer, so geh du satt mich nicht. Sag mir, wie erklärst die Durst? Klär dir, sag mir bald, vor der Wurst, weil bei mir bist du schön, bei mir hast du kein. Bei mir bist die eine auf der Welt. Bei mir bist die Git. Bei mir hast die It. Bei mir bist die Teiere von Geld. Viel schöne Mädchen haben schon gewollt, nehmen mir und finden sie alle ausgeklebt. Hab ich noch dir, bei mir bist du schön, bei mir hast du kein, bei mir bist die eine auf der Welt. Bei mir bist du Git, bei mir hast du It, bei mir bist die Teiere von Geld. Veel schöne Mädchen haben schon gewollt, nehmen mich hin, finden sie alle ausgeklippt. Hab ich noch dir, weil bei mir bist du schön, bei mir hast du kein, bei mir bist du eine auf der Welt. Bei mir bist du schön, bei
And that's one of the, it's kind of a central part of the Yiddish musical canon, I think. And as Cantor pointed out, the Andrews Sisters did a version. It got really popular outside of just the Jewish world, which is sort of a theme that we'll see later once there are Jews who start writing specifically for that purpose. But the songs of Yiddish theater were written mostly for Yiddish or for Jewish audiences. So that's from 1932. I want to go back in time a little bit to a slightly different song. This one was written by Abe Schwartz, who was one of the titans of Yiddish theater at the time. And last thing I'll say. One thing you'll notice about By Mir Bist Duchesne is that it's like a funny little love song, and also it's in a minor key. Look at klezmer, all the happy songs sound kind of sad. That's just a very Jewish thing. But this piece we're going to listen to, which is called De Grüne Cousine, which means the greenhorn cousin, a greenhorn being kind of the stereotype of the new immigrant to America. This is an example of a sort of archetypical song in Yiddish theater called the disillusionment song, which is about how the promise of the American dream sort of falls short a little for a lot of them. Do I know Yiddish? I almost know Yiddish, honestly, but I can read the letters because they're Hebrew. But this is your classic disillusionment song. And I want us to listen to it because then we're going to compare it to something a little bit different. Okay, so I'm going to share. I'm going to share the. I'm not going to share the lyrics because I'm going to read them to you in a second. Okay, so this was sung by Theodore Bickles, who Bickel, maybe. He was one of the Tevyas. He played Tevye a bunch of times.
Zum mir ist gekommen a Cousine, schön wie Gold ist sie gewähnt die Grine, Beckerlach wie Reute Pomeranzen, Fiesalach, was betten sich zum Tanzen, Beckerlach wie Reute Pomeranzen, Fiesalach, was betten sich zum Tanzen. Herralach wie Seidenweb gelogte, Seindalach wie Peralach getogte, Eigalach wie Himmelbläu in Frühling, Liebalach wie Karschalach a Zwilling, Eigalach wie Himmelbläu in Frühling, Liebalach wie Karschalach a Zwilling. Nicht gegangen ist sie nur gesprungen, nicht gerät hat sie nur gesungen, lebendig. Oh, das gewesen ist mein Cousine, lebendig und freilich jede Mine. Oh, das gewesen ist mein Cousine. Und also ja rippert seiner Jorn, von mein Cousine ist Sattel geworden. Peites hat sie wochenlang gekleben, bis von mir ist gar nicht geblieben. Peites hat sie wochenlang gekleben, bis von mir ist gar nicht geblieben. Heint er sich begegnen, mein Cousine, und ich frage, machst du etwas Grine? Sieht sie ab und legen in ihr Mine, brennen soll Columbus es Medine. Sieht sie ab und legen in ihr Mine, brennen soll Columbus es Medine.
Right, so there is no mistaking that is a Jewish song. It basically sounds like klezmer. And if we notice the lyrics, right, it's about a woman someone who has a cousin who moves to America, and then let's just go down to the middle here. Many years have since passed since they got them a job. My cousin has turned into a wreck. She slaved away for many years until nothing was left of her. Under her blue, beautiful eyes, black bags have appeared. The cheeks, those ruddy oranges, have aged and lost their greenhorn glow. Nowadays, when I meet my cousin and I ask her, "How are you, greenhorn?" she answers me with a crooked expression, "Columbus's land can go to hell." I mean, obviously it was in the Yiddish, but this is your disillusionment song. This is the story of an immigrant coming to America, hearing that the streets are paved with gold, and then working for pennies in a tailor shop, right? It became kind of a theme. And I think that's something that's in Yiddish theater that's similar to almost every American musical you'll see. It is very often a story about an outsider trying to succeed, right? Because that's the Jewish story. Now, here's something a little bit different. I'm not going to show you a video, and there's a reason why. But keep the melody of that song in mind. And I want to play the intro to a Gershwins song called Swanee. It's currently being sung by Al Jolson. And while I'm playing it, I'll let you guess why I'm not going to show a video. But just listen to the melody of the introduction.
I've been away from you a long time. I never thought I'd miss you so. Somehow I feel your love was real. Near you, I long to be.
So did you hear that? Like the da 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 da. It's basically the same melody, right? That's how we're going to move into American musical theater, because many of the early composers were clearly influenced by Yiddish theater and klezmer. Other influences they brought in, however, came from elsewhere. So if you hadn't already guessed, here's the reason I didn't want to show a video of Swanee. It is because it is sung by Al Jolson, and it is one of his famous songs that he would sing in blackface, which is not a thing we like nowadays. But in the 10s and 20s, many of the famous blackface performers were Jewish. That was sort of the popular entertainment at the time. That's what they were doing. I am not excusing it. I want to make sure we all know that. I am not excusing it. However, I do want to express something about why that may have been attractive to sort of the Jewish composers and performers at the time. And it's not just because it was popular. But let's do a set, right. So let's do a second about the Gershwins first. So George and Ira Gershwin are sort of the first real Jewish Broadway folks that we're going to be looking at right now. They were born respectively Jacob and Israel Gershwitz, right? Of course, back then you had to change your name as a Jew if you wanted to get popular in theater. And they came from one of the Russian Jewish immigrant families that came in the early the late 1800s. In fact, this was something I hadn't known. George Gershwin first tried writing music for the Yiddish theater, but it was rejected for sounding too American. I thought that was just kind of funny. But George Gershwin was the talented musician. It's been said that his parents bought a piano for Ira to take piano lessons. George sat down at the piano and started playing immediately. He was kind of a natural. But Ira became a famous lyricist. And one of the things he did was he would build his songs around American slang to make them kind of resonate with people. They certainly included elements from klezmer, as we can hear in the introduction to Swanee there. But George Gershwin would spend his time at Tin Pan Alley listening to the famous African-American musicians of the time. So he brought a lot of jazz and blues and ragtime and things like that onto Broadway. So he really drew from Black music in terms of how he wrote. Which brings me back to blackface, because one of the things that we see among the early Jewish Broadway writers and performers is that they were very often not comfortable telling their story through Jewish characters or explicitly Jewish story, right? They were writing these stories about outsiders, about African Americans, about people in situations of poverty. So they're fundamentally Jewish stories because they're about outsiders who are oppressed by a society who try to fight back against it. But they're telling their story through the stories of other peoples, the same way that a lot of the early slave songs, right, use the biblical narrative, right? Go down Moses, for example, right? That's using kind of the Jewish narrative to talk about the plight of African American slaves. So I think one of the most complicated and interesting uses of the African American narrative by the Gershwins was from what was then technically called an opera, Porgy and Bess, which is most famous for having an entirely Black cast. And I believe that the Gershwin estate still stipulates that all performances of it in the United States need to have a completely Black cast. It was first performed in 1935. It tells the story of Porgy, who is an African-American street beggar who saves a woman named Bess from her abusive lover and her drug dealer. Clearly, the situation draws on stereotypes about African-American life. It became more controversial moving into the Civil Rights era. I think it's slightly less controversial now. But I think what's interesting is that there's going to be something interesting that comes out of experiencing a clip from it. So this is the song "It Ain't Necessarily So," where all of the characters are having like a church picnic, and the drug dealer character is telling people that the things they read in the Bible aren't necessarily true. This is from the 1993 television adaptation.
It ain't necessarily so. It ain't necessarily so. The things that you're liable to read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so. Little David was small, but oh my. Little David was small. And diet, little David was small, but oh my. What do you zip it, zip it, he lived in the well. Home in that fish's abdomen. Oh, Jonah, he lived in the well. Little Moses was found in a stream. Moses was found in a stream. That child floated on water. The Lord, Pharaoh's daughter, she fished him, she saved him from that stream. What do you necessarily so. Oh, it ain't necessarily so. They tells all you chillin', the devils are villain, but it ain't necessarily so. To get into heaven, don't snap for a 7, live clean, don't have no fault. Look at me, I take that gospel whenever it's possible, but with a grain of salt. Methuselah lived 900 years. Methuselah lived 900 years. But who calls that living when no gallows given to no man? What's 900 100 years. I'm preaching this sermon to show it ain't Nessa, ain't Nessa, ain't Nessa, ain't Nessa, ain't Nessa,
All right. So that it's just a very fun piece. It's a little subversive. Clearly, it's being sung by a character I believe we're not supposed to be sympathetic to. But this is the thing that I found really captivating about it. So the sort of hook is, it ain't necessarily so, da, 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 da. So if you've ever been to services on a Saturday morning, before we read the Torah, there's a little blessing that we say that starts, Baruch Hu Adonai Hamvorach. Do you hear it? I think it's very likely that George Gershwin borrowed that kind of melody. He maybe directly from services, but certainly sort of the cultural memory of that kind of scale stuck with him. I just think it's really interesting that we have this sort of that the melody for a song sung by Black characters about how the stories in the Bible might not be true draws its influence from the blessing that we read at synagogue before the Torah. And it speaks to sort of this symbiosis in early musical theater between Jews and African Americans. Blackface was obviously a negative example of that kind of symbiosis, but so many of Gershwin's and other songs were later popularized by the great Black performers of their time. Paul Robeson, who was a very famous African-American singer, he sang Eli, Eli famously. He sang the Warsaw Ghetto Fighters Partisans song. He did a Kaddish. There was all of this mixing between Black and Jewish music at the time. I think part of that comes from the fact that you have two different groups that are both outside of the mainstream trying to achieve mainstream success, right? And so they're borrowing from each other and telling each other's stories through each other's, or telling their own stories through each other's stories. So that's the Gershwins. I want to be clear that the people I'm sort of highlighting are really representative of the time, right? Like there were lots of other people writing. For every Gershwin, there were another like 10 or 20 Jewish guys banging away on the piano trying to make a buck off of some music. So the next guy I want to bring in, he was originally named Israel Beilin, and Israel Beilin in 1893 comes off of the ship at Ellis Island with his family at 5 years old, with his earliest memory being a pogrom. That is an organized attack on the Jewish village in which his family lived. He remembers hiding in a ditch while the Cossacks burned the village. And he stepped off of that ship in New York. And the first thing he noticed was how different he was from the rest of the people in America by virtue of being Jewish. Israel Beilin would come to be known as Irving Berlin, which is a name that you may have heard. His father was a cantor who taught him how to sing prayers, and he was clearly influenced by Yiddish music at home. But he wanted to write popular music. He didn't want to write Jewish songs. Although some of his early works were kind of like, he wrote some kind of parody songs in the style of Jewish songs, but those were a novelty. That would be like Yiddle on your fiddle, play some ragtime, or Jake, the Yiddisher baseball player, right? Those are clearly meant to be funny. I'm kind of poking fun at sort of the klezmery, Jewishy kind of music. But he's known for writing what have become some of the most popular songs in America. You know him as having written White Christmas, which certainly at the time was the most popular Christmas song of all. Question comes up, why would a Jewish person write a Christmas song? There was a market for it, basically. He wrote the most popular Easter song, Easter Parade, and he wrote one of the most popular America songs, which is God Bless America. During World War II, he wrote a musical about the United States Army called This Is the Army. Putting on the Ritz, famous for the musical Annie Get Your Gun. This guy is a titan of the American musical canon, right? Not so the Jewish musical canon, but we see his influences from his sort of cultural background. But I think that I think it's interesting because, you know, the Gershwins and Irving Berlin both like drew from kind of common Jewish musical themes, but they were really writing for American audiences. And those are, you know, Jews are also Americans. I want to make that clear, like not to bring up like a dual loyalty kind of thing. But it kind of spoke to the American psyche in a way that basically he was more American than some Americans, I'm pretty sure. Like he got it more than people who lived here. So here's one of his early pieces that we'll listen to just like a little teeny bit of. This was his first big hit, which was Alexander's Ragtime Band. And I'm just going to share my sound. This is from 1911.
Oh my honey, better hurry and let me and ain't you going to the leader man, ragged meter man.
All right, so I think that gives us a little bit of a sense of that. You can hear he's using kind of American colloquialisms, saying honey, saying ain't instead. He's kind of speaking to the way that people speak on the streets. And obviously it includes elements of Black music from the time as well, like ragtime. But the song I really want us to listen to from Irving Berlin is a song called Blue Skies, which you may have heard before. It was written in 1926. This was I didn't know this. It was a last minute addition to a Rodgers and Hart musical called Betsy, which only ran for 39 performances, but the song became a big hit, which was that was very often something that would happen at the time. Back then, you wrote a musical, not really to tell a story, but to get some hits out of it, right? That's why a lot of the early musicals are, it's more like a review. So this was written after his, I believe after the birth of his first daughter. So let me do this.
Ladies and gentlemen, and invited transgendered species, in my study of Terran and Betazoid conjugal rights, I have discovered it is traditional to present the happy couple with a gift. Given Commander Riker's affection for archaic musical forms, I have elected to present the following as my gift, in honor of their conjugation. Never saw the sun shining so bright. Never saw things going so right. Noticing the days hurrying by. When you're in love, my how they fly. Oh, blue skies smiling at me.
Irving Berlin.
Nothing but blue skies do I see.
Oh, that was that. Oh, I'm sorry. That was clearly accidentally a depiction of the song Blue Skies from Star Trek Nemesis, which is a good movie, one of my lower ranked Star Trek movies, though. But that just speaks to the reach of it, doesn't it? Here's the version we're going to listen to.
I was blue, just as blue as I could be. Every day was a cloudy day for me. Then good luck came a-knocking at my door. Skies were gray, but they're not gray anymore. Blue skies smiling at me. Nothing but blue skies do I see? Bluebird singing a song, nothing but bluebird all day long. Never saw the sun shine so bright, never saw things going so right. Noticing the days hurrying by, when you're in love, my how they fly. Blue days, all of them gone, nothing but blue skies from now on.
All right, we're gonna stop there. But you'll notice this is a song written after Irving Berlin had his first daughter. It's about the joy of family life, and yet we notice that the chorus starts with a minor chord. It starts in E minor, and Klezmer teaches us that even the happiest songs can sound a little bit sad. But what we find is that a lot of Irving Berlin's kind of like, quote, novelty Jewish songs, almost all of them from the time he wrote this, feature a shift from E minor in a verse to a major key in the chorus. So I think what's sort of Jewish about this song is this blend of major and minor inflections. This was kind of characteristic of some of the Jewish composers at the time, to the point that Richard Rodgers recalls meeting Cole Porter, who told him that the key to writing hits is to write Jewish tunes. So whatever that means. And that was performed by Irving Kaufman, who was a vaudeville performer at the time. The other one was Brent Spinner as Data in Star Trek Nemesis. So this brings us to three men who came from sort of a different kind of background from Berlin and the Gershwins. These are second generation Jewish immigrants. They come mostly from German Jewish families. So that is Richard Rodgers, Lorenz Hart, and Oscar Hammerstein II, right? So I want to point out at first, I am related to Richard Rodgers. It turns out that's something that my family is fairly proud of. My dad's mom's mom, who is my great-great-grandfather on my father's side, her husband and Richard Rodgers' father-in-law were first cousins. So basically, my great-great-great-grandfather was cousins with Richard Rodgers' wife. So not a blood relation, but still, I think that's pretty big. I think that's big. So let's start with I have my notes here. So we'll start with Oscar Hammerstein II, right? Whose grandfather was Oscar Hammerstein I, who owned a number of theaters in New York City, right? He was kind of New York theater royalty. Sorry, 1 second here. Richard Rodgers, on the other hand, no, actually pretty much the same, was also born into a family of German Jewish immigrants. They changed their names from Rogozinski, and Lorenz Hart also came from a family of Jewish immigrants. The reason I'm pairing them all together is because kind of their most famous couplings are Rodgers and Hart and Rodgers and Hammerstein, right? But they obviously all wrote other things. Rodgers and Hart went to the same summer camp, Camp Wigwam in Waterford, Maine, although not at the same time. Going to summer camp was just a part of American culture. Interestingly enough, that same camp was also attended by Herbert Sondheim, and then later his son Stephen Sondheim, J.D. Salinger, Frank Lesser, and Charles Strauss, who's famous for writing Bye Bye Birdie and Annie. But I still recommend that we send our kids to URJ camps when we can, even though there are places that seem to breed famous composers by the bushel. Rodgers and Hart as a team are known for writing shows like Pal Joey and Babes in Arms in the 20s and 30s. And these were the musicals that were more about, generating hits, right? You want to sell the singles almost. So Lady is a Tramp, My Funny Valentine, those come from there. But you could have those songs without the musicals, essentially, which is what happened. When Rodgers and Hammerstein start working together, you get shows more like Oklahoma, Carousel, The King and I. These are musicals where the book, the narrative, is deeply intertwined with the songs, right? Because for a lot of them, Oscar Hammerstein wrote the lyrics and the book. And because they now have stories that are intertwined with the music, what they end up doing is they start sending really powerful social messages through their music. They were pointing out prejudice, the treatment of immigrants. Obviously these are probably connected to their families' experiences, right? But these are ways that they are also telling the Jewish story, right, about the underdog who makes it big, through other people's stories. So Showboat, right, is about a mixed race singer on a showboat in the South. That was Oscar Hammerstein and Jerome Kern. We can also look at Lerner and Lowe's My Fair Lady, right, which is about a flower girl with a Cockney accent who makes her way into mainstream society. They're writing about the Jewish experience through outsider characters that are not Jewish, right? Very often through the story of African Americans in America. The song we're going to look at is from South Pacific, which is a musical from 1949 about a nurse stationed in the South Pacific during World War II, who falls in love with a French expatriate with mixed race children. And it also includes a romance between a Marine and a Tonkinese woman, like a local Native woman, and then having to reckon with how their relationship would be viewed by people in America. So this song is called You've Got to Be Carefully Taught. And I think it has a very pointed message that I think will be immediately clear once we hear it.
What makes
this is from the movie.
Talk like that? Why do you have this feeling, you and she? I do not believe it is born in you. I do not believe it.
It's not born in you. It happens after you're born.
You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made, and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be carefully taught.
I feel like that nationwide event may have already passed. But this is clearly a song where the message is racism is bad, but also that it's something that comes from being told and taught to hate others. This was a very controversial song. Rodgers and Hammerstein basically had to fight their funders to keep it in the show. When South Pacific toured in the American South, there were lawmakers in Georgia who passed a bill outlawing entertainment, and I'll quote, with an underlying philosophy inspired by Moscow. This was, of course, in the Cold War with McCarthyism on the rise. And one lawmaker said a song justifying interracial marriage was implicitly a threat to the American way of life. So this is one of the ways that from the American Jewish experience, Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein learned that they had an obligation to use their art to fight for justice, essentially. Yeah, so this song has been used in teaching. That's wonderful. I think it's really good that it's in there. I think it's really good that the show got popular and that people hear it. Because, Rodgers and Hammerstein, their family experience was the Jewish immigrant experience. That's what they knew. That's what they wrote about, but they told it through people who weren't Jewish. There is a quote I have now from Kurt Weill, who we're not going to hear a piece of music from, but he was a famous composer in Germany before he moved to the US, but he's known for Three Penny Opera over here. But here's what he says, and this is about the immigrant experience. What the immigrants of today are bringing to this country is not more and not less than what immigrants from earlier persecutions have brought here. All they ever could bring was the work of their hands and the work of their heads. That's what they offer to this country and what the people of this country are so ready to accept. But that is just what has made the American civilization, the accumulation of talent from all parts of the world, freed from oppression and limitation, ready to give and to build. And that's what people like the Gershwins and Irving Berlin and Rodgers and Hammerstein and Hart and so many others experienced. They were able to cut their teeth in the American music, in American musical theater, when there were so many other jobs that wouldn't accept them by virtue of them being Jewish. And it was an opportunity for them to tell their stories, the story of Jews, just never in the guise of stories about Jews. Which brings me to another musical that was originally going to be a story explicitly about Jews, but then was changed. You may actually know it. Essentially, Jerome Robbins wanted to direct a musical called East Side Story about Jews and Catholics. And it was basically supposed to be kind of a modern day telling of Romeo and Juliet, right? Does anyone know what that eventually became? This East Side Story? You can just open your mic if you want.
West Side
I want people to say it. It became West Side Story, right? Instead of being about Jews and Catholics, which was, an immigrant experience happening more at the beginning of the 20th century, it became a conflict between Puerto Rican and Italian immigrants, which is what was going on at the time, right? But it's still about the immigrant experience. And the song I wanted to play is one called America. And I think what's important about it is that it is about struggling to maintain your identity and your culture in American society. And then I'll talk a little bit about who wrote it. Full screen. And this is from the 2009 Broadway revival, which really interestingly included a lot more Spanish. When the characters who would speak Spanish were alone, very often they would be singing in Spanish, but not in this recording.
In each room. Automobile in America. Chromium steel in America. Wires put in America. Very big deal in America.
So I'm going to pause it there. I think we get the idea. This is a song about, what it means to live somewhere and long for somewhere else, romanticism for the old country. Now, this musical was composed by Leonard Bernstein with lyrics by a relative unknown at the time who went by the name of Stephen Sondheim. Leonard Bernstein is, of course, Jewish. We all know this. He wrote symphonies about the he wrote symphonies that included the Kaddish and Jeremiah. Like, he was a very Jewish musician. Almost nothing he wrote for Broadway was really that Jewish. He didn't really write Jewish music for Broadway, but you can see that this musical in particular speaks to the immigrant experience, which for a lot of the century was the Jewish experience. Which brings me to, the pinnacle of American musical theater achievement, a man named Stephen Sondheim. I wonder if, my lips are even worthy to say his name, but they need to be today. Stephen Sondheim was essentially foster fathered by Oscar Hammerstein II because he was friends with Hammerstein's son. Oscar Hammerstein had him write 4 different musicals with sort of 4 different stipulations. Then Hammerstein tore them all to shreds and helped him make them really, really good. He said it was the best learning experience a person could ever have. And his sort of first foray onto Broadway was writing lyrics for West Side Story. Jerome Robbins afterwards wanted him to compose and write the musical Gypsy, but Ethel Merman refused because she was worried that Sondheim was so young. And I envy anyone who lives in the alternate universe where Sondheim both wrote and composed Gypsy. If you know anyone over there, tell them to look me up. And what's interesting, this is what I think is really interesting about Stephen Sondheim as a Jewish composer on Broadway. I think that he was not dealing with the same struggles that other Jews on Broadway were dealing with. He did not really write about the Jewish experience or Jewish stories. I think he was not struggling with what it meant to be Jewish in America. He was struggling with what it meant to be gay in America. So all of his musicals tend to be about trying to understand love, essentially. That was sort of the axe that he had to grind. So he didn't really write about anything Jewish. He didn't really have Jewish characters explicitly. I think there's one line in the musical, Anyone Can Whistle, that actually mentions Jews. But there's a reason that I'm including him, and that's because he's the best Broadway composer who ever lived. But also because what we see is that he grew up in a time when Jews were much more comfortable in the United States. They were a lot more assimilated, a lot more accepted, didn't face a lot of the same institutional barriers. We know now that anti-Semitism still exists, but he was almost accepted enough in society that he could focus on the other ways that he wasn't being accepted in society, right? So I think this is the last song we're going to hear. This is a song about, I guess, the true meaning of love. It's from his 1970 musical Company, which is about a bachelor and all of his friends are couples, and it's kind of that struggle. And this particular recording I love because it includes Sondheim being kind of a tyrant. This is from the documentary of the recording of the original Broadway cast recording. So let's just give this a listen.
Being alive, take 1.
It starts with some notes.
Someone to hold you too close.
You're very good, and I don't want to spoil something that's potentially marvelous, and I need more guitar. Let's hear guitar.
This is the first time I really like to feel rhythmic looseness. What you do right here. That's the explosion. That's the flower bursting. And that's where you can take rhythmic liberties. And just what you're doing. It's fine. That's nice and free.
Well, maybe there's one more ending. Let's find out, huh?
You know, practically swallow the mic on the end.
Okay, I'll stay on.
Also, we're gonna slow up the tempo.
Someone to hold you too close. Someone to hurt you too deep. Someone to sit in your chair to ruin your sleep.
That's true, but there's more than that.
Is that all you think there is to it?
You've got so many reasons for not being with someone, but Robert, you haven't one good reason for being alone.
Come on, you're onto something, Bobby. You're onto something.
Someone to need you too much. Someone to know you too well. Someone to pull you up short, to put you through hell.
You see what you look for, you know.
You're not a kid anymore, Robbie. I don't think you'll ever be a kid again, kiddo.
Hey, buddy, don't be afraid that it won't be perfect. The only thing to be afraid of really is that it won't be.
Don't stop now. Keep going.
Someone you have to let in. Someone whose feelings you spare. Someone who, like it or not, will want you to share a little, a lot.
And what does all that mean?
Robert, how do you know so much about it when you've never been there? It's much better living it than looking at it, Robert.
Add 'em up, Bobby, add 'em up.
Someone to crown you with love. Someone to force you to care.
Oh, come on.
Someone to make you come through. Who'll always be there, as frightened as you of being alive. Being alive. Being alive. Being alive.
I think I have to pause it there, sadly, but thank you for indulging me on that song in particular. Gets me every time. But I hope you can sort of see the arc from the beginnings of Jewish involvement in musical theater to now. We start with Yiddish theater, where all of the stories are Jewish. We see the early composers who take some of their Jewish musical influences and start writing songs for much bigger audiences. We see Jews telling the Jewish story of oppression and redemption through the stories of other outsider people. And eventually we get to Sondheim, who is almost exceptional as a Jewish composer on Broadway for having written nothing even identifiably Jewish, right? Jews are so fully integrated into the world of Broadway that you almost don't know who's Jewish anymore. But the point is, if you look at someone on Broadway, there's a very good chance they're Jewish. Next week, what we're going to look at are those explicitly Jewish stories. Once composers for American audiences start feeling more comfortable telling the story of the Jews through the story of the Jews, if you get what I'm saying. That's where we're going to get to Fiddler. That's when we're going to get to some others. We're going to have some lesser known gems, and there's going to be a lot more listening to music than talking. But I hope that this impresses upon you that the story of Broadway is the story of the Jews and vice versa. I think what's good about Broadway is what's good about the Jews and vice versa. So I know it's 1 o'clock. So if anyone has to go get to a meeting or something like that, although I don't envy anyone going out in this weather right now, feel free. But if anyone wants to stick around to ask some questions, I'm really happy to share them or just share things that came up during this. I'm going to stop recording, though, I think. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Rabbi. That was excellent.
It's my greatest joy to be able to teach this, honestly.
Thank you. Wonderful production.